All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for taking time on your Friday afternoon to be here with us today. This training is supportive housing right for your organization. We're excited to offer this training really geared towards organizations who perhaps have been thinking about getting into supportive housing and are wondering what that might entail. So today's webinar is going to be 2.5 hours with a 10-minute break in the middle. Your presenters today are myself. My name is Matt Rayburn. I am the Deputy Executive Director and Chief Real Estate Development Officer for the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. And I have my wonderful colleague Leah with me today. Leah, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon. I am Leah Hicks, and I'm Senior Program Manager with the Corporation for Supportive Housing, or CSH, in our Indiana office. Glad to be with you.
Thanks, Leah. So what we're going to do, start off with just a couple logistics. We assume most of you by now are familiar with using Zoom. We would encourage you to collaborate throughout this training in one of two ways. If you are not actively speaking, we would ask that you keep yourself muted, optional whether or not you want to be on camera. And if you have a question at any point during today's training, we want to hear from you. We want this to be interactive and make sure you leave with your questions answered. So feel free to either use the chat function. Leah and I will be monitoring the chat and answering questions as we go. Or if you prefer to unmute and jump in and ask a verbal question, we welcome that as well. So we hope that you feel comfortable asking questions in either of those formats. We'll do our best to answer questions as we go, and we're trying to leave about 15 minutes or so at the end for an open Q&A as well. So we will leave time, but don't feel bad about jumping in and interrupting as we go to make sure you get those questions answered. Now, the elephant in the room, though, is are we going to truly be able to answer the question on the slide here and tell you if supportive housing is right for your organization? Probably not. We can't tell you that necessarily. What we can do today is provide you information to understand what are the key principles of supportive housing. If you were to work with IHCDA and CSH to develop and to operate supportive housing, what would our expectations be of you? What principles and philosophies would your organization need to adapt to run supportive housing? And then we hope that this will give you enough information to go back and have those conversations in your community and with your coworkers to decide if this is a good fit and a good model for your organization. So with that introduction, today's agenda is going to start with a brief introduction for CSH and IHCDA. We know many of you may have worked with us in various capacities, but we'll take just a couple moments to explain the roles of our agencies, particularly in the realm of supportive housing. Then really our longest session today, we're going to go into a supportive housing 101, just making sure we're using common language and have a common understanding of what are we talking about when we say supportive housing. From there, we'll dig into just a little bit more of specific topics. So we'll talk a little bit about tenant selection. Who would live in our supportive housing developments? How do you find and select those tenants? We'll dig a little bit deeper into the harm reduction philosophy, which you would use for supportive services and engaging with individuals who may be dealing with mental illness, substance use disorder, history of trauma, etc. And then we'll kind of wrap up the topics with talking a little bit about eviction prevention and why it's important in supportive housing to use eviction only as a last resort to keep vulnerable households housed safely. And then again, when you go back and are thinking about, is supportive housing right for us? These are those things you'll have to ask. Are we open to an eviction prevention mentality, a harm reduction mentality, to using the housing first approach, which we'll talk about during supportive housing 101. And then at the end, if you're enjoying the session and you think, yeah, this is something we could get into, the last 10 or 15 minutes of the session, we'll talk a little bit about how do teams who want to do this work, how do they apply, what's the process you would go through, and how would you work with IHCDA and CSH to make this a reality. So that's our agenda for today, and we're excited to dive in. So first off, as I said, we're going to introduce just briefly our organizations. So I'm going to kick it over to Leah to talk just a little bit more about CSH, both nationally as well as the work they do locally.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, with CSH, while we have our Indiana office and some of you have worked with us prior, CSH is a national organization. We're made up of about 160 employees across the country. We have physical staff in about 30 states. However, we operate in every state, as well as Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So we're really out there working with everyone across the country, and the different nuances that happen from state to state and region to region. Our focus is very much on these 4 pillars, if you will. So training and education, like we're doing today, like we do with the Institute. We do have a lending arm, so we are able to provide different types of lending for different types of development and property, and including pre-development loans that Institute partners readily use throughout the years in the Institute. We have staff who do a lot of policy work, and we reform at both state and federal levels. And we have our consulting and technical assistance arm as well. So we have a really robust training center. If you haven't visited our training center, certainly encourage you to do so, csh.org, and you can quickly get to our training center from there. So very, robust opportunities there as well. Next slide. We really hone in on 3 key drivers, one being to really use data to drive our results, really thinking about using best practices and focusing on outcomes and data to inform what we're doing, to inform how we provide support at all different levels of the work we're doing. We really want to focus on thriving, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. How supportive housing is a catapult for helping people thrive, helping communities thrive, and really, again, building communities and through supportive housing and the work we do. And an emphasis and focus on racial equity, and really thinking about that through all the lines of work and business that we do. From supportive housing and working with individual tenants and individuals to the work we do with agencies, all the way through our lending. So CSH has a lending initiative right now that's really focusing on identifying and developing and partnerships with BIPOC developers. So a lot of work there, again, throughout all the work we do. Next slide. Our role in Indiana, kind of bringing it back home here, we provide that the CSH Institute each year, which we're certainly talking about today. We provide technical assistance ongoing to those Institute teams. So I think we're going into our 14th or 15th year with the Institute. We're still, working with those providers and projects from many years ago. We want to provide that ongoing technical assistance and do so through memorandums of understanding. Working on providing that feedback through a policy lens. We work really closely with Matt and folks at IHCDA to really think about where are we targeting supportive housing and what populations are in the greatest need from year to year, even region to region. Focusing on bringing best practices to our state and being progressive from that standpoint. Working on different funding resources so that we can continue to bring high quality supportive housing and services to those in need in our state and our providers. Being really diversifying that funding, and that is similarly with increasing investments in supportive housing, and then really looking at engaging new partners and not just sort of our traditional community of homeless service providers, but knowing that it's much bigger than that. And so working with managed care entities and hospitals and those primary healthcare providers in building those partnerships and really amplifying the work that we're able to do.
Excellent, thanks, Leah. So I'll briefly introduce IHCDA as well. So the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority is a quasi-state agency for the state of Indiana. Unlike CSH, who's doing national work, we are exclusively doing work in the state of Indiana. And our mission is to provide housing opportunities, promote self-sufficiency, and strengthen communities. So IHCDA runs, at any given time, we're running about 40 or so federal and state programs. Most of our programs are federally funded, where we are passing federal dollars down to nonprofits, local units of government, and developers throughout the state of Indiana to support affordable housing, and in this case, supportive housing work. We really play a number of different roles in the state. Many people think of us kind of in this first role as the state housing finance agency for the state of Indiana. So again, kind of that state agency charged with administering affordable housing and some non-housing community development programs as well. We are also a public housing agency. So some of you may be familiar with your local public housing agency that administers programs like public housing or housing choice vouchers in your community. We are a statewide public housing agency serving those areas of the state that do not have a local public housing authority. So we touch all or parts of 82 counties in the state administering the housing choice voucher program. And then we are also what's called the collaborative applicant for the Balance of State Continuum of Care. The Balance of State Continuum of Care guides a lot of strategy and policy for the state around homelessness and working to end homelessness. That includes overseeing the homelessness management information system, the coordinated entry system, which we'll talk about much more later today. And then a lot of other planning and work, including gathering data through things like the annual point in time count. So the Indiana Balance of State Continuum of Care covers 91 out of 92 counties in the state, so everywhere except Marion County. And IHCDA serves alongside that group of really kind of volunteers who make up the Balance of State Board, and we're called the collaborative applicant. So we help the Balance of State Continuum of Care apply for HUD grants and then administer those grants with the goal of ending homelessness. And perhaps most importantly of all, really want you all to lead today with this understanding that IHCDA is and wants to be a partner to you in your work, whether that is just someone to bounce an idea off of, to help convene a meeting, kind of work on thought leadership and policy, but we really do want to help you kind of move your goals forward. So we may not always be the right funding solution, but we're always happy to brainstorm and think about how to support housing and community development activities throughout the state. All right, so with that introduction behind us, it's time to jump into the meat of today's presentation. And this is to, we're gonna spend probably about 45, 50 minutes really just kind of going over what do we mean by supportive housing. So when we talk about supportive housing, we're talking about not just affordable housing. Affordable housing is incredibly important. It is a big part of IHCDA's work. But it's really taking that affordable housing to the next level by providing wraparound on-site supportive services for residents who are really kind of the most vulnerable residents in our communities. So the supportive housing model can actually be used to serve a variety of populations. Since 2008, IHCDA has really focused its work in collaboration with CSH on developing supportive housing for individuals experiencing literal homelessness, and in many cases, chronic homelessness. So the longest term homelessness, individuals who are the most vulnerable. However, we've also adopted that model to serve other populations. So we've done supportive housing for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, for individuals with substance use disorders and mental illness, et cetera. So the model of supportive housing, of providing affordability with high quality housing with on-site wraparound supportive services, can really work for a variety of vulnerable populations. For today, we're really going to be focusing on and talking about the kind of that traditional supportive housing, which is serving individuals who are experiencing homelessness and getting them straight out of homelessness and into housing. That is the work we do through the Supportive Housing Institute, which we'll talk about a lot today. So that's really where we're going to focus. But if any of you are interested in serving other populations, we're happy to have kind of one-on-one side conversations later about other funding programs and initiatives we have that may be able to serve those populations. So today we're going to go through 6 key components of supportive housing. And I guess I should pause. Yeah, I see Leah's put a very important note into the chat. I should have mentioned this in the logistics at the start. Everyone will receive copies of these slides, so don't feel like you need to write everything down. We are also recording today, and the recording will be made available as well. So this will all be available for you to rewatch. So as I was saying, we're going to go through 6 key components of supportive housing that really show for those who want to develop and own supportive housing, what are those key principles that you would be implementing and the philosophies that your organizations would need to adapt to provide high quality, or what we sometimes call high fidelity supportive housing. So we'll talk about engaging households with multiple barriers, again, serving those most vulnerable individuals in our community. Affordability is certainly important. We'll talk about the importance of providing leases and really having supportive housing in many ways looks like traditional rental housing, but with services and other supports available. We'll talk quite a bit today about how you provide services in a flexible and voluntary manner, the role of various partners in making this all come together and happen, and how supportive housing really should be part of connecting to a community and integrating vulnerable individuals into the broader community, not keeping them separated. So let's start with the first of our key principles here, which is understanding that when we're talking about supportive housing, we are talking about serving those households in our community who have the most barriers, who have the highest vulnerability, who but for supportive housing may not have other housing opportunities in the community, right? So as I mentioned, we traditionally think about this as being individuals who are literally homeless, particularly those that meet the HUD definition of chronic homelessness. I mentioned we've also done work here around intellectual developmental disabilities, mental health, substance use disorders, and then there's a wide variety of other populations that could be served through a supportive housing or similar model, which could involve child welfare systems, justice systems, identifying individuals in your community who are frequent users or high utilizers of the emergency systems. So those could be those who are frequently going to the hospitals, through the correctional system, et cetera. And then sometimes we'll do supportive housing that takes one of these categories like homelessness and then layers on some subpopulations. So homeless veterans, homeless youth, homeless families, et cetera. So we want to really kind of drive home this point of understanding that while supportive housing is extremely effective, and we believe it is one of the primary ways we have been able to reduce homelessness in our state, supportive housing is not necessarily for everyone. Again, it really is about those most vulnerable households and serving those with the highest need who really do need supportive services, long-term housing affordability. So we're going to look at 3 just super quick case studies here. If we were doing a live training, I'd kind of scan the room and ask you to weigh in, but I'll just pause and let each person individually reflect. So here we have the Smith family. The Smith family has just recently become homeless due to a loss of job. So the Smiths do not have a history of homelessness. They have not landed on the streets or in the shelter. They have a family member, in this case a sister, that they're able to stay with temporarily. And as I mentioned, this is their first time experiencing homelessness. So everyone can kind of reflect for a moment and think about, would the Smiths likely be a good fit for supportive housing? And our answer is likely not. It's not that the Smiths may not need affordable housing, and they may, of course, as we all do, need certain services. You know, in our lives, we all need access to health services, mental health services, et cetera. But in this case, the Smiths is not a household that we would say kind of elevates to that level of vulnerability. They do not have a history of long-term homelessness. At least from the information we're provided here, we're not seeing issues related to disability, to mental health, to substance use disorder. Really, this is a family we see that they have become homeless very, very recently, and it's due to an economic factor, right? So we would generally say the Smiths are maybe someone we would want to refer to a more traditional affordable housing setting, or we might want to connect with short-term rental assistance through programs such as rapid rehousing or emergency rental assistance, et cetera, where they may need a few months of rental assistance to get back on their feet, maybe some connection with some job coaching or employment training to find a new job, but probably don't necessarily need long-term on-site supportive services. But here we have Joe, and we want to think about, is Joe a candidate for supportive housing? Joe has been in and out of a shelter for the last year, has a history of drug use, and we believe is likely engaging in some amount of current substance use. And in addition to a history of homelessness, has a history of being involved with the criminal justice system, has been in and out of prison or jail. So again, everyone can kind of reflect for a moment, think about kind of the differences between Joe and the Smith family. And while, of course, we would need to know more about Joe than what we know here, likely Joe is someone we would say is a candidate for supportive housing. Why? Joe is showing those signs of long-term vulnerability, right? Has long periods of homelessness. This last period has lasted a year at this point. We know the shelter could not be a long-term solution for him forever. We're dealing here with issues of disability and mental illness as we think about the substance use disorders that have historically and likely currently are active. And again, as we went back to that first slide, thinking about who are the frequent users, those who are engaging in costly public systems like the correctional system. We know Joe has some history of recidivism, of being involved with the legal system. So Joe is checking a lot of boxes here and is someone that we would say could very likely benefit from a supportive housing setting. And then finally, we have Tina. Tina is also kind of like the Smith family, has recently become unemployed, was working, but lost her job. Unlike the Smiths, she didn't have family to go to. Because of that job loss, she has temporarily landed in a shelter, but she's only very recently been there. And it seems like, Tina it may be that some of her alcohol use or dependency could be a contributing factor, perhaps, to her recent unemployment, but she does not have any long-term diagnosis, substance use disorder, or disabling condition. So again, take a moment and reflect. And here we would say, well, again, we would want more information. We would certainly say Tina is getting closer, perhaps, than the Smith family 2 slides ago. Tina is, again, not necessarily an immediate candidate for supportive housing. Again, she does not have long-term homelessness. She has just recently become homeless, again, due to an economic situation. We may, of course, want to connect her with traditional services in her community, perhaps to the community mental health center, a recovery center, et cetera, if she is indeed expressing that she wants some help with her alcohol use. But kind of like the Smiths, we would see that Tina most likely needs an immediate intervention, some short-term rental assistance, rapid rehousing to get back on her feet, again, connection with services to get reconnected with her job. So none of these are definitive. Again, as the caseworker was working with these individuals, as we were understanding their vulnerability more, those answers could change. But the point of this exercise is to really start thinking through, again, understanding that when we're talking about who is the best candidate for supportive housing and who we want to use these limited resources to serve, we're trying, again, to serve those individuals with the highest vulnerability, medical vulnerability, substance use disorder, history of homelessness, and make sure we're connecting those individuals with those intensive services. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more of the key principles here, and this is that housing is affordable. This one is pretty cut and dry, much like in kind of traditional affordable housing. And if you think of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's traditional definition of who is cost burdened, we want to make sure that in a supportive housing setting, a tenant is never paying more than 30% of their household income towards rent and utilities, right? Now, in affordable housing, this sometimes is a stretch goal because the household, while the rents are restricted or controlled, the tenant is still responsible for paying their full portion. So in affordable housing, unfortunately, we do see sometimes the tenant is still paying more than 30%. In supportive housing, we know with these highly vulnerable households who may be zero income at the time they enter the supportive housing, it's critically important to make sure we're not rent burdening them. So in the supportive housing model, we always bring project-based rental assistance to the table so that there is a long-term subsidy to pay rent. And the way that most, not necessarily all, but most project-based rental assistance programs work is you would calculate the tenant's adjusted income. They would be responsible for paying up 30%, and the subsidy would pay the rest directly to the landlord. And the last one that I'll touch on before turning it over to Leah to dig deeper into services is our third concept here, which is that supportive housing provides tenants with a lease. So it's important here to kind of pause. We've talked a little bit about what is supportive housing, but we haven't yet necessarily said, well, what isn't supportive housing, right? So supportive housing is not a shelter. It is not a transitional time-limited setting. So transitional housing, it's not a group home. It's not a recovery housing situation. So when you think about those models, we are absolutely not here to say that those models don't serve a purpose, that there are individuals who certainly benefit from those models and they may be needed in the community. But supportive housing is just kind of serving a different niche, a different role. So when you think about those other models of transitional housing, shelter, group home type settings, right? You're generally thinking about housing that may be time limited, where an individual can only be there for 12 months or 24 months and then has to leave regardless of where they are in their life. We also think about those programs, generally necessarily wouldn't have a lease or a traditional lease. They might have instead just a program agreement, and those program agreements may have more behavioral things in them. So curfews, mandatory participation in group activities or services, right? That is not the supportive housing model. So the supportive housing model, in many cases, as I said, except for who we're serving and the fact that we're offering services on site, but when it comes to the actual lease part of it, it's really much the same as what our traditional either market rate or affordable housing would be. Our tenants have a lease. They have all the rights and responsibilities of a leaseholder, just like any other renter in the state of Indiana. If you have multiple units available, that tenant has the right to choose which unit they want to live in the development. They have the right to be explained their rights and responsibilities under the lease. And you, of course, have your right then to expect them to follow those lease obligations. And so there's not behavioral language, just like if I was renting a market rate unit, there wouldn't be language in my lease that says I'm not allowed to drink a beer. There wouldn't be language that says I must go to a group meeting 3 times a week. The lease is the lease. It's enforcing you must pay your rent. You must not, destroy the property, etc. But our lease would be almost identical to any other lease in the community. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Leah to start talking about the next principles of supportive housing, and particularly to dive into this element of supportive services.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And yes, as Matt spoke, we're going to focus in a little bit more on those flexible and voluntary services. Matt, yeah, you got it. I know we got these little steps in our slides. So very much to follow up and hone in more on what Matt was saying, is one of the really important tenets of supportive housing that separates it from other types of housing, whether it's transitional or even permanent, affordable, is this component of those voluntary services. And knowing that we start with providing that supportive housing environment, but that we don't stop there. We provide those ongoing services. And those services, some are on site, some are referral based, and folks then have access to those services in the community. But we very much hone in, and as we talk a little bit later about the different partners within your institute team, should you move forward with this, having a really competent service provider as part of the team who will provide on-site services is really instrumental and really key. And so we want to make sure that we have a range of services that folks have access to. So we know that individual needs are going to vary. And so we want to be able to meet those tenant-centered needs and kind of have that variety or menu of services that are going to meet the needs of the households that we're serving. And, you know, we've said flexible, voluntary. There are no conditions of occupancy based on services. And one of the things we like to say is that services are voluntary for the tenants. They're not voluntary for the service providers. And so, you know, we go a lot more into, a lot more in depth in the Institute about assertive engagement and a lot of different practices and philosophies to really support that, that statement of how those services are made available and are engaging for folks that we're serving, but they're not required. Before I move on to the next slide, I just want to ask, and again, you can reflect on this, maybe folks could throw a couple ideas in the chat as to why are services important? I mean, we've kind of been saying that, but you know, what is it about this service piece that's important? We want to get people off the street. We want to help house homeless individuals, but what else?
Leah, we have one comment in the chat. This one says that transportation is a key issue.
For sure, right? So, and right, address underlying issues. So yeah, so transportation, that's a huge one. Certainly eliminating that barrier of transportation is having those on-site services. We know we can't do everything on site, so how do we make sure that we assist individuals in accessing services they may be referred to or off-site as well? But yeah, you're hitting on those topics now, those teaching those skills, building that self-esteem and confidence. Yeah, so those underlying issues that might have led to the chronic homelessness. Natural supports, I love that. So yeah, you guys are hitting on so many of those main elements that, you know, focus on once individuals are housed, then focusing in on those services that are important to the individual and they're tenant-centered, but they're also services that are going to help maintain that housing. So we'll talk some more about that as well. But next slide, Matt. Yeah, so you guys have most definitely, you know, hit on these as key points. The difference in helping vulnerable persons not only obtain but maintain that housing. And that's foundationally what supportive housing and Housing First are all about. And we'll talk a little bit more about Housing First here in a few slides. But, you know, I mentioned Thrive being one of those foundational elements that CSH hones in on. And that's where this really comes in, is helping households and individuals that we're serving and supportive move forward in their recovery and really thrive. And so, and then you mentioned removing barriers and how key and important, you know, that is, and building those relationships. We know that everybody who walks into supportive housing and has a unit isn't then going to be like, hey, Leah, now I'm housed. I cannot wait to get involved in all the services you have to offer me, right? Like, that would be wonderful. That's not how it works. We have individuals that, you know, they're not comfortable with our systems. They haven't had good experiences with our systems. And quite frankly, we have to build that trust. And so the Housing First and then moving forward with being there to provide the services when they're ready and meeting them where they're at. Next slide. And so kind of, you know, continuing on that theme, the idea of best practices in the way in which we deliver services. I mentioned meeting people, you know, where they're at and providing those individualized services and that range of service. Really honing in on assertive engagement and making sure our staff have the skills that they need to engage individuals and build those relationships. And so, Matt mentioned that, some of the elements and data we see about individuals who are target populations are those frequent users. And so what we hope and what we do see in outcomes with supportive housing is that as people are in supportive housing and are able to access those services, we start to see that decrease in using the emergency rooms for maybe primary medical care and those sorts of things. We see improved health outcomes, mental health and substance use outcomes. But again, we have to do that thinking about meeting people where they're at and what they identify that they need at that point in time. And looking at cost too, right? So we know that along with those proved outcomes comes that cost reduction, but we have to be there meeting people where they're at. Next slide. So we talk a lot about, how we go about building those relationships, building trust, engaging individuals. And, Matt certainly spoke to the population that we're serving that may have those mental health and substance use challenges. And it's important that as we think about developing supportive housing and the services that are needed, that we have that continuum. So for some individuals, abstinence may indeed be their goal. For others, we really need to be thinking about harm reduction and ways in which we can improve their lives while maybe ceasing use of a particular substance or behavior is not their goal. So we're going to talk a little bit more about harm reduction here a bit later, but we want to work with individuals to think about, are there things that they're thinking about changing? And that change is based on their desires, their goals, and it may include that reduction or eliminating high-risk behaviors. And that we really are focusing our services on helping people move forward in that change process and their desire for change. Some of you may be familiar with motivational interviewing in stages of change and how important those best practices in service delivery are. And again, this last bullet point really speaks to how important it is that our philosophy is on keeping tenants housed and maintaining their housing. And we really only deny access to services or look at having to, ask someone to leave housing when someone's safety is compromised. And so we really, really hone in on that. We'll talk some more about that in eviction prevention, but that's a really important tenet. Next slide. So I talked a little bit about staff and the importance of making sure that the staff we have on site really are equipped with the skills that they need so that they can really then help build those relationships with the persons we're serving, their family, the community. And that then at the same time, then our folks that we're serving, our tenants, are able to become parts of their community. But we know that people can still engage in risky behaviors while also achieving goals and moving towards goals. So it's the way in which we think about this that, we help individuals move forward with those goals, even if it's, again, not abstinence-based or it's not, exactly that idea of ceasing behaviors. And to go along with that, we're not condemning or supporting clients' choices to engage in those harmful behaviors. And really hard to see someone, you know, going through that process and engaging in behaviors that are harmful. However, we respect that, and we work alongside them, again, in identifying where they're at. And we're not protecting people, right, from experiencing those consequences. So sometimes we hear that housing first or supportive housing is you know, isolating people from, you know, consequences or those sorts of things. And it's not at all. We're walking alongside people as they take risks and have that dignity of risk and that right to failure. But we walk alongside them during that. Next slide. So this is a slide that sort of demonstrates what might the different supportive services provided in supportive housing look like. Some of these would certainly be on-site. Some would be partnerships that you develop with service providers in the community, thinking about the transportation and other barriers that might be in place to access those, you know, off-site services. But again, thinking about it, an array of services, a continuum, a variety that meets the different needs. And that's something you'll be building in your institute experience, is based on data and the population that, you know, you'll be working with. Which of these services do you really need to amplify and have on site, and who do we need to add to our team to make sure we have these partnerships? And you know, this isn't an exhaustive list by any means. So if you have other thoughts or ideas of supportive services, you know, certainly throw them in the chat. Next slide. So in thinking about service planning, so we just talked kind of, you know, very high level about philosophy and different practices that are key. We're going to talk a little bit more about some of those even in today's webinar. But not only do we talk about them as being important, part of the Institute experience is working with those partners, the service partners, the property management partner, the development partner, and other you know, other partners that you may want to consider bringing along. But it's really working together to identify this service plan. So even one of the deliverables that you will create for part of attending the Institute is a very robust service plan for your project or your property that will include everything you see here, so these bullet points, if you will. And so this is so important because it's the guide that's going to say, this is what we plan to do. And it kind of takes you down to, you know, this is who's going to employ these particular types of individuals, how many we will have, our staff to client ratio, you know, how often will they be on site, what are our outcomes. So it gets, you know, very detailed. And I think that's a key piece to the Institute is the benefits of being able to work together to create some of these documents. But it's more than just the creation of the document, because it really is then, it serves as your guide in moving forward for how you'll deliver services across your property on an ongoing basis. So it can be that living document as you see service needs changing across your tenant population too. So I won't read everything on the slide here, but certainly speaks to kind of how robust this plan is, and how serious I guess we take the fact that having those on-site services is absolutely paramount in, again, that housing stability and sustainability that we strive for individuals that we're serving. All righty, so Tenet 5, as we go through our six top, not top, but our six foundational elements of supportive housing, is that coordination among key partners. So we've already kind of talked about, players in the institute, if you will, and again, we'll certainly talk about that more today. But a big element, again, that I think really distinguishes supportive housing from affordable housing or other types of housing is this coordination. And when we speak coordination, we're talking about property management and supportive service providers. So we don't have each operating in their vacuum, but we also know that they each have very important distinct roles and expectations and skills. So while we respect that property management has these duties and services have these duties, they certainly come together in identifying how to best serve the tenants at that property. And so that linkage and coordination and keeping tenants stably housed is ultimately the goal of both entities, right? And so maybe in mainstream or market rate housing, we don't necessarily always feel that way about that the goal is to keep tenants housed. Yes, maybe from an occupancy standard approach, but in supportive housing, property managers also need to have that philosophy that not only do I want to keep my units full from an occupancy standard, but the goal of supportive housing is to keep people stably housed. So if we have to ask someone to leave or evict someone, that is a huge, huge, huge thing. And we'll say this multiple times, it's a last resort, because that's our ultimate goal of what we're doing. And we need property management and services to have that same overarching goal, even though they get to that in a different way. So next slide. So as I've said, we kind of have, this is a little tongue in cheek as far as show me the money from a property management standpoint and services. Oh, I just want to help. But that common goal being keeping tenants housed, as I mentioned. But again, that property management does have these distinct roles that, we're going to pop up on the next slide. But really keeping that common goal in mind as we come together and look at dealing with crises and everyday issues and, making those tough decisions about, where we go next. Next slide. So when we think about, okay, what are those responsibilities of the service provider as opposed to the property manager in this context? Oop, it jumped forward, didn't it? Thanks. So service providers, certainly coordinating with property management, and coordination can look different depending on where a property is at and what's going on, but we really recommend that there's weekly intentional coordination between property management and service providers. What we hear is for most properties, there's daily communication that may be informal, but and then really helping tenants navigate benefits is a big piece, right? So helping people access healthcare, helping people access Social Security or disability benefits, other entitlements, if you will, that they may be eligible for, but we know how key that is. And again, helping people thrive and recover and move forward after initially accessing housing. Definitely helping manage crises, whether it's building related or it's symptom related, family related, whatever that is. And then providing that case management. And so having that on-site case management to help make those linkages and coordination. And it may be case management that provider also provides some on-site skill work and tenancy support services and those sorts of things as well. And so, like it says, employment, connecting to the community, removing barriers that are existing to folks being able to access the community. Next slide.
Hey, Leah, we have a question in the chat. We've had a few
Oh.
and some I'm purposely holding for later, but we have one right now since we're talking about services where someone wants to know what resources are out there so service providers know more about what types of funding sources and payment models are out there to fund this work.
Right. Yeah, no, that's certainly key. And, you know, I don't want to start with a downer statement, but absolutely, that is an area where every supportive housing project is always looking at how do we obtain and sustain funding. I think now more than ever, there is more focus and understanding about the importance of that. And I would say that at local levels, state levels, national levels, that sort of, even though we've been saying this, you know, as providers for a long time, it's sort of, oh, there's a light bulb that we keep providing the rental assistance and the structures for supportive housing, which are so key. We certainly don't want to see that go away. It's been amplified with a lot of the COVID funding. But now we also are seeing more emphasis on how do we also support the ongoing services. So we're seeing some of that happen again through some of the home ARP funding and some of those sorts of things. So that's one way. We're seeing new funding streams for supportive services come through. We're seeing some more creativity, maybe that's the right word, within COCs, looking at how to build in supportive services into projects and making sure that it's not just rental assistance, but there's supportive services. A lot of communities work really hard to connect with a community mental health center. And so a number of our Institute projects have service partners who are community mental health centers because they can access that Medicaid funding, and particularly the Medicaid rehab option that covers case management and skills and peer services. But we also have very successful supportive housing projects that might not always have their main service provider be a community mental health center. So it's not a deal breaker. I want to make sure that's clear. And so partnering with federally qualified health centers has been a more frequent or a more recent model that we've seen, you know, given that that's, I guess, more of a relatively new funding stream or a new model. But they often have that mental health, substance use service component along with the primary health care. So it can be a really nice match for services, and they too can bill that Medicaid and Medicare and insurance. So we see a lot of communities do their own fundraising, and I don't want to get too much in the weeds. There's service reserves that are built into LIHTC and those sorts of things. So it's a challenge, but it's very, very doable as well. Did you want to address any other questions in there, Matt, or we kind of holding off?
Maybe just one more, if you wouldn't mind briefly, Leah. So we had one more question about services, and it's kind of, what do you see as the role of community health workers in this work?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that, Angela. We see the work of community health workers, and I'll actually extend that to community health workers and or certified recovery specialists or people with lived experience, peer specialists. I know we have different titles for those roles, but community, Troy's waving, and community health workers, CHWs, absolutely. It would be, you know, a key employee, could be a key employee in supportive housing. We have some examples of that where we're seeing that grow more and more. We're working on some funding opportunities and some different things in some regions of the state to amplify that further, where we support community health workers and peer specialists in being able to access positions, working with providers to create those positions, and again, thinking about those traditional case management and different types of positions. Can we also have community health workers and peers that are doing that work, and how essential they can be in that engagement work and being those connectors to their communities and the services in the communities, the health services. Yeah, Brittany, you're talking about, navigating people through the community and the different needs. So yes, perfect example, and why we're saying that these positions definitely have their place and need to have their place in supportive housing. Thank you for those questions. So we talked a little bit about service provider responsibilities, now property management or property manager responsibilities. Again, on-site property management, depending on the size of the development, a full-time property manager, sometimes we see, several days a week in smaller properties, but definitely on-site, involved. They know the tenants who live there. And they don't know them from the standpoint of the way a service provider might, but they know they know the individuals. They're familiar with them. Work with them to remove barriers that are related to keeping them stably housed. But we also know that there are things like ensuring that program eligibility, both at the start with the application process and working with coordinated entry and getting those referrals initially and ongoing, establishing eligibility from the standpoint of the funders, and there's a lot that goes into that. We know the property managers work at enforcing leases and promoting building safety. So as Matt spoke to, everybody has those leases. And yes, we do hold people accountable to what's in their lease. You have to pay your rent, right? And so, we can work with you on, maybe a rent repayment, or there's something going on. But yes, you are responsible for paying your rent. You are responsible for, peacefully engaging with your neighbors and on the property and not disrupting neighbors. But we also work with you around, okay, what are those barriers? What's happening? Working with the service provider to identify what can we do to help if you're struggling with getting along with someone or noise or guests. So it's not this gotcha approach, right? It's more, we want you to be successful. So while we're going to hold you accountable, we're also going to work with you on figuring out how to be successful and how to make this work, because we have the same goal. And then having inspections, key areas of overlap. So I started to talk about that a little bit on the last slide, but we know that folks in service delivery and property management work together on that intake process. So oftentimes we're able to see those services staff follow someone from homelessness, from outreach, from shelter, through to getting into housing, and focusing in on identifying, who those tenants are going to be. The orientation is a big piece of this. So sharing those orientation responsibilities, maybe getting the lease signed, but then staff are working with a person around understanding that lease, and getting someone oriented in their new apartment. Paying rent. Sometimes it's not that people don't want to pay their rent, they're just not sure how and where and when. And so working with them around that, and property management and supportive services can and certainly do that together. Same thing with disruptive behaviors. You know, again, it's not that gotcha, it's how do we work together to support each other as staff doing two different jobs with the same goal, but ultimately supporting the tenants too. And that while property management is responsible ultimately for the building safety and the facility, how it looks, how it functions, supportive services play a really key role in that, and working with tenants around, you know, keeping the building in good shape and a safe place to live. And then those customer service, tenant grievances. So as you see even this list, there's a lot that if you're in property management or services on this call where you see your roles, but isn't it great to then have entities that can come together and really catapult and maximize the success in these areas for the tenants we're serving?
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there, Leah, that, you know, a role we're not talking a lot about at this part of the training is also the role of the developer who is building the supportive housing and obtaining the funding. But when we think about the building, that's really an area where we would hope that property management and supportive services would have overlap in helping the developer plan and design the building, right? Because the developer maybe doesn't necessarily have a lot of experience in services. So this would be a great opportunity for a service provider to work with them to think about what type of common space do we need? What type of one-on-one case management space do we need? Thinking about kind of trauma-informed design that's a very peaceful and welcoming environment, et cetera. So throughout supportive housing, there's a lot of places where we really hope that people don't just get in their lanes and not talk to each other, right? We hope that the partners are really intersecting throughout the whole project.
Yeah, great point, man. Yeah. All righty. And finally, talking about connecting tenants with the community and how key this is. And I think that, you know, I really want to emphasize that sometimes that community engagement and integration piece kind of falls by the wayside because we're dealing with crises or we're doing these sort of things. But I want to amplify that when we really put emphasis and focus on helping people integrate and become part of their communities, a lot of those other crises and different things can kind of work themselves out. But that being said, we want to make sure that we create our properties, build our properties and projects in areas that are in safe neighborhoods and they're in proximity to these things listed on the slides, right? So we already know transportation is a barrier, finances are a barrier. So we don't want to put a beautiful supportive housing project out that's 10 miles away or even 2 miles away probably from, you know, from access to all of these important services that folks need to recover and be part of their community and thrive in their communities. And so, you know, really thinking about that from the minute we start talking about site selection and then moving forward. And then, you know, also thinking about how the community or the property itself is a community and how we work to build community within there and how we bring the larger community inside. So we have properties that have different kinds of community-based services, but also the natural support services. So maybe there's an AA group that meets on site. Churches are coming in and you know, providing meals or providing support. We have you know, food pantries that end up being on site. And so there's lots of different things to build and bring in the community as well. So you know, we're not talking a lot today about it, but it's something we talk a lot more about during the Institute. So next slide, Matt. So housing first. When we talk about supportive housing, we certainly talk about housing first. And Matt, I think if you click once more, there might be a header.
Yeah, the title.
Yeah, sorry about so this interwoven supportive housing and housing first approach. And so foundationally, you know, if you're interested in doing supportive housing and really, you know, want to do this well from an evidence-based standpoint, Housing First is a tenet that you really have to focus and believe in, and that it's really quickly housing people experiencing homelessness, because we want to reduce that trauma of being homeless, and then be able to build those services in. And so it's housing first, it's not housing only. But we don't create a bunch of barriers for people to be able to get into housing. We know that if you're homeless, you deserve a place to live. We want you to be housed, and then we work with you on being able to move forward on what's next. Yeah. Next slide. Some of the core tenets and components of Housing First, and you're going to see that these fall in line with what we've talked about in supportive housing already today, but really focusing on tenant choice and educating individuals about their choices and opportunities. There's low barriers, and it's targeted. So Matt's going to talk here a little bit more about low barrier when it comes to tenant selection, and but also there aren't a lot of barriers to getting into housing. You don't have to have, you know, a great background check. You don't have to have income. You don't have to, you know, have a squeaky clean background. We want to be able to easily get people into housing. The application is simple, those sorts of things. We talked about those voluntary services. Again, that focus being on housing stability, focus being, you know, this slide talks about property management and services separate. And what this is really saying is that you don't have a service provider who's also the property manager, and they're that dual role, not separate from lax coordination. So I want to be clear about what this slide means, that coordination is still there, but the roles are separate. And then we're going to talk about harm reduction here shortly. Next slide. So I like these visuals because it helps us think about how Housing First is different. It's not this traditional stair-step approach where someone's experiencing homelessness and they have to prove their way into permanent housing by saying, well, if you go to the shelter and you do okay there, then there'll be the transitional housing and you can stay there 3 to 6 months, and then maybe permanent housing. And lots of times there's compliance with treatment, and you have to meet some level of stability or abstinence, those sorts of things. So we take that out with Housing First. And basically it's, if you qualify, you meet eligibility, coordinated entry, the target population, you know, that we've kind of spoken about, you move into housing and it's permanent. And the expectation at that point is your lease. You know, we provide those services if that person is indeed interested. But again, we don't give up on that. So we provide that ongoing flexible support to meet that need. But there isn't this stair step. You have to, you know, work your way through to deserve housing, permanent housing. It's not that approach. Next slide. So again, this is kind of just re-emphasizing that we don't ask these questions that you see here. You know, we connect with the person, we get them housed, then we provide the services and supports and connections that help keep them housed. Next slide. And we know it works. Lots of information and studies and data out there that show there are high housing retention rates, fewer hospitalizations, fewer hospital visits, so emergency room, as well as psychiatric, reduced involvement in the justice system, greater satisfaction from individuals who are living in supportive housing. We see a cost savings across all different systems. And then healthcare utilization, we see more people using healthcare and being able to access healthcare.
So Leah, we are at the halfway point, so I think we should give folks a break here in a second. There was one question that related more to services that we hadn't hit yet that I thought we could end with before the break. Someone had asked, kind of, is it typical, or what would the role of peer support be in supportive housing?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think this is a topic in and of itself that I would love to talk with anybody about more. So reach out. I think the role of peers in supportive housing. I mean, I think multiple areas, but I always think about the engagement piece and the connection piece and the relationship. Being able, to say, hey, I have been there, or I've had similar experiences. This is, maybe this is what's worked for me. It's being able to have a connection with someone who really has had that experience or that similar experience. That those of us who don't identify as having lived experience, and lived experience that we could be talking about previous homelessness, we could be talking about substance use, we could be talking about mental health, behavioral health. So I'm kind of putting those all in a basket here. But being able to work with someone who's truly been there, as opposed to those of us who can't identify with that lived experience, makes a connection. And that connection then doesn't magically mean someone is interested in traditional services, but it makes that connection and that support, someone that you feel like you can connect with and talk to. And then then maybe there are other ways to provide those supports, and work with someone on moving forward with their goals. And again, I could talk about this all day, but I think it helps us non-peer, I'll say, service providers, really holds non-peer service providers accountable for thinking about services in a different way, and identifying what recovery looks like and what can be possible. So I think this is an area where we need to see the field move a great deal, as far as who we staff in supportive housing. So.
All right, thanks, Leah. So we do want to give everyone time to stretch. We've been talking an hour and 15 minutes. We know this has been a lot of content. So stretch, go to the restroom, get a drink, whatever you need to do. We're not going to do a full 10 minutes because the questions have been so good. I want to make sure we have enough time. So it's 2:15. We're going to do a 7-minute break. We'll start back at 2:22. Thanks, everyone, and we'll talk to you in just a few minutes.
Matt, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Perfect.
First, because I got cut off, it did stop the recording, so I'll start it again.
Okay. It's okay. I guess we didn't really need the break recorded anyway.
Good point. It probably, I don't know, it might be in two different files now, like starting a new one.
Yeah, it'd be like a first hour, second hour. Okay. Yeah, that's okay. Okay, well, good afternoon again, everyone. Welcome back to the second half of today's training. We're going to go ahead and get started. So far we've really done I think a nice 101 on what is supportive housing. And now we're going to dig it just a little bit deeper in a few of those areas, starting with tenant selection. So before we jump into that, I did want to acknowledge that there is one question that came in the chat over the break, which is, how would you find out if there's already supportive housing in your county or community? IHCDA does maintain a list of all supportive housing that it has been involved in funding, and we have that available as both an Excel file that lists each property, as well as we have a map. I believe that Zach and Victoria, or at least one of them still, from IHCDA supportive housing team is on this webinar. So since I'm about to train, I'm going to ask if one of them could drop the link to that list on our website into the chat as a good starting point for that resource. So good question, and we'll get that loaded into the chat. So we want to talk just a little bit more about the idea of tenant selection here, and particularly the importance of creating a tenant selection plan that meets the housing first principles that we've been talking about, particularly the concept of low barrier entry and serving persons with the highest vulnerability. So when we are talking about Supportive Housing Institute projects, so again, our supportive housing for persons who are literally homeless, we require that Institute projects utilize their regional coordinated entry system as the means of tenant selection. So what this means is, unlike a traditional affordable housing development, you're not marketing the project, you're not putting it on social media, the local newspaper, hanging up flyers, advertising your housing, nor is property management maintaining a property specific wait list of, okay, here's, when I have a vacant unit, I have 10 people that have already signed up for my housing. Rather, you utilize your region's coordinated entry system. And coordinated entry system is that regional system kind of overseen through the Balanced Estate Continuum of Care, or in Marion County by the Indianapolis Continuum of Care. And what coordinated entry does in a nutshell is it is a list of known persons experiencing homelessness in your region. And those individuals are then ranked using a vulnerability index that considers such factors factors as medical vulnerabilities and age and amount of time homeless, disability status, et cetera. So all these factors go in and calculate a vulnerability index. So when you build and open your supportive housing development and you have units open, you would contact your regional coordinated entry lead, and that information is available online as well, who the coordinated entry leads are for every region. And you would contact them and say, I have a unit available, please send the next person on your list. So this method ensures that the next highest vulnerable person experiencing homelessness in your community is keyed up and immediately referred over to the unit. So again, you don't have to really do any marketing. You're not figuring out how to maintain this wait list. It is done through this regional system for you. And this is an excellent way of quickly getting referrals and ensuring we're serving the most vulnerable. Now, you would still do some screening and eligibility of that individual. The reference, or I'm sorry, I should say the referral from coordinated entry does not necessarily mean that they are automatically qualified for the unit, but it is very likely that person is going to qualify. So we'll talk a little bit more about that kind of idea of we need to screen tenants and what that might look like. So every supportive housing project, as well as every affordable housing project, is going to create a template document that identifies how they are going to handle tenant selection at their property. So we call this the written tenant selection plan. The purpose of a written tenant selection plan is really twofold. One, it's ensuring fairness, transparency. So it is, again, a written policy. Applicants coming to your project or people referred to your project have the ability to see that tenant selection plan to know how they are going to be screened. You would then apply that tenant selection plan consistently to your applications, and this provides that level of consistency and transparency. Secondarily, your tenant selection plan would also be designed to ensure program compliance, both with any funding requirements of the programs you're receiving. So whatever sources you get to build the building are going to have requirements on them, as is the project-based rental assistance that you receive. And then that second piece of the compliance then would be ensuring that you're meeting all federal, state, local non-discrimination requirements. And we'll touch just very briefly on what some of those are. So when we think about this tenant selection plan, this written document that you would be creating for your supportive housing development, a tenant selection plan is really going to have kind of three different areas. We have true eligibility, who based on the funding sources and your funders' requirements, who is eligible to live here. Here we would be looking at, is the individual homeless? And again, coming that referral from the coordinated entry system. Depending on the funding sources going in, it may require not just homelessness, but homeless with a disability. That's part of that chronic homelessness definition. And then the capital sources and the rental assistance sources that get the building funded are also going to impose things like income limits. A lot of federal programs have student status limitations because they're not designed to do dormitory housing for full-time students, et cetera. So you'd have to put together all those pieces of eligibility. Secondly, then, once you determine someone is eligible, yes, they meet the federal and state requirements to be allowed to live here. The second piece then really is a screening piece. And screening is where we are going to say, is this person a fit for the housing, right? Traditionally, screening may take into effect a number of things. Most traditionally, we'd say credit, criminal, previous landlord. That's what most market rate and affordable housing developments are going to screen for. Do you have the ability to pay? Do you have a relatively clean criminal history? And do you have a previous history of good housing, of not being evicted, of paying your rent on time? We're going to call your previous landlords and find out, right? That's a pretty traditional screening system. When we think about the clients we're trying to serve, this could raise a lot of flags, right? So if we're dealing with individuals who have been homeless long-term, they probably don't have a good housing reference or any housing reference at all. We know individuals we're dealing with, either because of substance use disorder and mental illness, may have criminal background related to that, or just the fact of being homeless may come with it certain criminal background and justice involvement for things such as trespassing, nuisance crimes, public intoxication, public urination, et cetera, the type of things that just happen when you live on the streets, right? So we know by default we're dealing with households that are perhaps more likely to have some type of justice involvement, to have poor housing references, and very little income. So that credit check is probably not going to come back so good either. So are we going to turn all those folks away? No, we're not, right? Those are the exact people we are trying to serve and get into a supportive housing model. So we really say when we come to screening in supportive housing, we know there's going to be rental assistance that's covering the rent. So the credit check is really not necessary, right? We would not see a credit check on a supportive housing development. On criminal background, there are some things that would still be reasonable to screen. We'll talk about that just a little bit more. And then again, the housing reference, we know we're taking individuals straight out of homelessness. We would see that scratched off the list as well. And there's a couple questions coming in about criminal. Again, we'll talk about that a little more in depth in a moment. And then the final piece of your tenant selection plan. So we've talked about who is eligible under program regulations, who's eligible under our management company screening policies, and then you kind of put it all together. So part of the tenant selection plan is also your process and procedures. How do you process that application, and are there application fees? Obviously for this population, we try to eliminate fees because someone coming straight out of homelessness probably can't afford such a fee. How do you handle some type of wait list? That's kind of in a traditional affordable housing tenant selection plan. Again, you're not maintaining a special wait list here. You're just going to coordinated entry, right? So your tenant selection plan would say, our referral source and our wait list is our regional coordinated entry. And when we have a vacancy, we contact them and they send us the next person. You would also in a tenant selection plan identify things like if we reject someone, what are the reasons for rejection? And then what allowance do they have to either on their own or with an advocate or caseworker appeal that decision? How do we process the appeal? Who on our staff is going to review the appeal in a neutral way? And then the tenant selection plan will also generally cover things like in what cases would we allow someone to transfer between units, and how do we make sure that when we have accessible units with features for individuals with physical or mobility impairments, that we are trying to get individuals who need those extra accessibility or adaptability features into the units that have those features. So going back just a little deeper, when we think about program eligibility, again, our capital funds are going to have requirements on income eligibility, some student status requirements, and then we would then say that our rental assistance is going to have very similar things. You have to be income qualified, there's student status. If we're looking at programs under kind of the Section 8 umbrella of rental assistance, like project-based vouchers, there is a citizenship requirement where at least someone in the household has to be a citizen. And if there are non-citizens in the household, the amount of assistance can get prorated. So it would actually be less amount of assistance. Those are federal rules from HUD on how you calculate that. And if you are using project-based vouchers, which is the most common rental assistance source we've seen in recent years going into supportive housing, there are two federal requirements on criminal background. And one of this is the area we've seen a lot of questions in the chat already. So there are two things that if you're using project-based vouchers, you are unfortunately screened out for. The first is if you were convicted of manufacturing methamphetamine in public housing. In private housing, anywhere else doesn't matter. But if you built your meth lab in public housing, HUD says, no, we're not serving you with HUD sources anymore. And then for those of you who are saying you have trouble serving that population, completely understand the issue you're facing. But unfortunately, the HUD regulation, if you're using project-based vouchers, is that lifetime sex offenders are not eligible either. So we would expect that generally in supportive housing, unfortunately, those two restrictions would be in place. But you could theoretically in supportive housing have no other criminal screening. You could allow any other criminal type background into the project. What we would generally see here then is that when we think about criminal backgrounds, you're going to really be focused on conviction, not arrests. That is a HUD requirement. HUD says that you must base decisions on screening on conviction records, not arrest records. Conviction means I was found guilty. Arrest means I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I looked guilty. not necessarily that I was ever found to have done anything, right? So when we are thinking about criminal background screening, it must be based on conviction records only. And HUD says even at that, we cannot put into effect just a blanket policy of no convictions ever. You have to consider the severity of the offense and the length of time since the offense. So severity, someone got kind of a white collar type crime of some fraud, cashing a check fraud or something. Is that really a risk to your project? Is it a risk to the tenants at your project versus violent crimes, arson, things like that? But even with those violent crimes that you may say, well, that poses a threat to my other tenants, to the building. HUD says we've got to look at the amount of time that has happened since then and what rehabilitation efforts have been made. So I'm 80 years old. I had some assaults on my record from when I was in my 20s. Am I really still a risk at anyone, or am I someone that should be housed, right? And we can look at data on recidivism and kind of the current best practice over time. It's kind of dwindled down. Some of you may know the old days. There's a lot of talk about, after 7 years, not much recidivism. Really right now we see more of a standard, usually 5 years or less is enough to say that it's unlikely someone will commit the same crime again if that much time has passed. So there is a lot of decisions that have to be made by property management and owner on what their screening is going to look like. And in IHCDA funded supportive housing, IHCDA and CSH would work with you as the owner and management agent, and we approve all tenant selection plans. So we would work with you to ensure that we're being as low barrier as possible, knowing, as we've seen in the chat today, you're working with individuals who do have various backgrounds. We don't want to screen them out. We like to say our goal in supportive housing, as we move into the next slide, is to screen people in rather than to screen them out. There is plenty of housing in our community that's going to screen people out, right? Basically anywhere else these clients go, they're going to be screened out for not having a good housing history, for not having a good credit history, for having criminal records, et cetera. We want to be the housing that says we are going to accept you. And we know that with the model we're using, being an evidence-based model, with the services we're providing, we believe we can house you and end your homelessness. So when we think about what's different, what's unique about a tenant selection plan in supportive housing versus affordable housing, that first one really is that true focus on, to the extent possible, we screen in, not out. We've talked about we have a referral system that is coordinated entry, and we'll take those referrals. We're not doing our own wait list. And then the third thing, and this just kind of comes with all the fund sources, right, is there's just a little bit of extra regulatory compliance. Usually we're mixing often multiple capital sources to get the project built. We're layering in a project-based rental assistance contract. So the rules start to, mix. You may be comparing multiple sets of income limits or student status rules or whatever, following them all and saying, is the household eligible here? So supportive housing, unfortunately, tends to be a decent amount of paperwork because of all the sources on it, but it's worth it to get these individuals housed. So the final piece here of tenant selection, and we could certainly do a full, hour and a half, 2 hour training just on non-discrimination. Today, we just have one overview slide here, right? So our tenant selection plan needs to specifically acknowledge, and our organizations, as we think about, is supportive housing right for us? We have to be willing to follow the state and federal non-discrimination requirements. That includes fair housing, which has a number of protected classes. We can't discriminate based on race, color, religion, sex, national origin, disability, familial status. Section 504 comes in with federal funds and says, we need to do certain things to increase the accessibility of units. And we need to, if 504 is triggered by your funding source, if a tenant needs a modification to their unit because of a disability, we as the owners have to pay for that modification as long as it's reasonable. We've talked already about HUD's criminal background guidance. We need to make sure we're not violating fair housing. We need to only look at convictions, not arrests. No blanket, no conviction policies. We've got to be more nuanced about this. Again, what's the nature of the event? What's the severity of the crime? How long has it been, et cetera? We'll inevitably be using some type of HUD funding in these projects, which means we'll be subject to HUD's equal access rule. Equal access expands on fair housing by saying in HUD funded housing, we cannot discriminate based on marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity. And then finally, VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, which applies to all genders, sexes, sexual orientation, not just women, despite its name. And this is really protections for survivors of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking. So we've had a couple questions in here about the intersection of how does disability impact eligibility? And the answer is it really depends, right? So when we talked earlier in one of the early slides that supportive housing can serve a variety of target populations, right? Today, we're really kind of lasering in on the homelessness side of this, which is most of the supportive housing work we do. However, there is non-homeless focused supportive housing that focuses on persons, for example, with intellectual and developmental disabilities, who maybe are living with an aging parent, have never lived on their own, and they need a solution because that parent's not going to be able to care for them longer. Or they've been living in an institutional setting and could exit into a more independent setting with access to services, right? So there's that whole side of supportive housing. In the homelessness sphere, the answer is it depends. It depends on the funding sources going into the project and what the definition of homelessness is. So unfortunately, sometimes we have to slightly vary what definition of homelessness we are using depending on what funding sources we have available to put into a project. If the funding source is going to require the true chronic homelessness definition, part of the definition of chronic homelessness is a disabling condition. So if our supportive housing development was for chronic homelessness, there would, at that eligibility level, not just you screening, but at the true program eligibility level, there would be a test of a disabling condition. Great questions. Okay. So that's kind of our primer on the tenant selection side. Again, we know that you may have tons of questions today. This is really just that intro to get you thinking about, is this the type of work I want to do? We expect you'll have questions. We expect you may want one-on-one discussions. But for the sake of time, we're going to go ahead and kick it back to Leah to get a little deeper into the service philosophy around harm reduction. I'm sorry, I should say there is one question I should address. So someone said, is permanent supportive housing different? And it's not. So when we talk about supportive housing versus permanent supportive housing, we're talking about the same thing. That permanent test, again, is just saying that supportive housing is not time limited. It's not transitional housing. Once you move in, as long as you are following your lease, you are allowed to continue to stay. So a supportive housing resident may stay in supportive housing 20 years, whereas again, in transitional housing, usually it's about 24 months max is when you would time out. So when you hear permanent supportive housing or PSH, it's the same as supportive housing. All right, Leah, over to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for that clarification. And yeah, to echo what Matt is saying is, remember the Institute, and we're going to talk about the components a little bit later, but the Institute is across 4 months and 11, jam-packed days. And we're doing, just a little bit of overview today to wet your whistle and get you interested in, as Matt said, thinking about, am I interested in, and, taking this to the next level. And so as we talk about harm reduction here, we bring it up as a really important tenet of the services work that we do and the philosophy. And we recognize that harm reduction as a philosophy and can be difficult for some people to grasp and understand and fully embrace. We recognize that, and we challenge people to test where they're at as they hear this information. And recognize that, again, we're working with a population of individuals where more traditional approaches don't always work. If they did, people might not be homeless. People might not have these barriers, things. And so we have to be open to the idea that there are multiple ways and multiple paths for people to be successful and to have that stability in their lives, both from a housing standpoint, but also from a health standpoint. So again, we're just going to get started talking about harm reduction. And, if you're in the Institute later, we talk a lot more about it. And even then, we could do days of training on it. So we just wanted you I just wanted to kind of start by giving you that introduction as to why it's so important and why we're honing in a little bit today. So this first slide, really just a quick little quiz, but which of these is not a component of harm reduction? And so, and again, we'll just ask you to take a minute and weigh in on these. I'll give you a chance to read them, and then we'll talk about it. Reducing consumption, an individual's decision to engage in risky behaviors is accepted, and the individual is expected to take responsibility for his or her behavior. Okay, so which one? Okay. Well, we'll kind of go through and do a process of elimination. We've got some ideas in the chat. So B, an individual's decision to engage in risky behaviors is accepted. Yes, B, I see B. Yep, individuals responsible for their own behavior, right. So which one is not a component? And so what we actually know from harm reduction is that reducing consumption as a goal is not actually a component of harm reduction. And so reducing consumption might be a goal for an individual person. So that may be where we're being tricky here. But it as a philosophy is not the goal, because the individual has to identify what their particular goals are. Harm reduction as a philosophy is looking at how do we work with each person and that engages in risky behavior and help them reduce that harm. So it may not be reducing consumption. So just to kind of help with understanding and clarifying that. But an individual's decision to engage in risky behaviors is accepted is a really important piece of harm reduction, because we have to respect that individual can make those decisions and can engage in risky behaviors, but that does not exclude them from continued support, continued supportive housing, and living in their unit. But instead, how do we help them identify ways to reduce the harm while they may also engage in that risky behavior? And again, it doesn't mean that they don't take responsibility for their behavior. Harm reduction is not about rescuing someone or stopping those consequences that may happen. And some of those consequences can be justice involvement. They can be health consequences, familial and consequences with support systems. We don't take away that responsibility or per se rescue, but we're still there to walk alongside that person as they experience those consequences, perhaps, and help individuals move forward. Next slide. So I've kind of, really spoken to a lot of what this slide speaks to. So the Midwest Harm Reduction is an excellent place to learn a great deal more about harm reduction practices. But again, promoting and supporting the right of people who engage in risky behaviors to have that dignity and respect, and that right to self-determination. But then also we have that collaborative process at the same time. Next slide. From a harm reduction standpoint, individuals have a voice, and that, again, focuses on reducing harm, not a specific behavior. So, for instance, if someone is using a particular substance, they're not interested in looking to stop using that substance at this time, but perhaps they have a part-time job that they really, really love and are interested in keeping. Then how do we work with them on identifying, what could you do to help make sure you're keeping your job as you continue the choice to use? And so then we're talking with them about how are we going to reduce the harm. Now they may decide, I'm gonna not gonna use, within so many hours of when I go to work, or they may identify, a different way of getting to work, or different interventions and things they may access to help manage. But we're not deciding for them that reducing the uses is the choice here. It's reducing the harm. And so first identifying what is the harm, and then connecting it back to how then do we, it lessens the impact on the positive things that are happening. So because of that, we don't have predefined outcomes. And so the outcome or the expectation of harm reduction practices is not abstinence. For some people, that may be where they ultimately choose to land, if you will, or that might be their ultimate goal. But that's not the predefined outcome. And if that's where we're at as a service provider, then it's hard for us to really hone in and look more at the picture right now about reducing harms at this moment. We talked about the other couple of bullet points here. So next slide, please. So again, this is really thinking about it as a service provider as these practical strategies that you can use to help support an individual in managing and reducing those negative consequences of use and use or risk. And we talk about different potentially harmful activities. And so it's not just about substance use, but it can be folks who have sexual risk, or maybe do sex work and different things. So any risky behavior that someone is engaging in that's risky to them, we can work using the harm reduction strategies to help reduce that harm. So it really is about safer techniques, managed use, and again, abstinence can be a component of it. So sometimes we hear a lot of criticism about harm reduction because it doesn't focus on or end at abstinence, but in no way is abstinence, not seen as a potential component. Talking about meeting people where we're at, we've been talking about that today, and that certainly is important here as well. Next slide. This idea of negotiation, and so if you're going to have these tough conversations, and I think that's what's so important about harm reduction. We have to be in a place as a service provider where we can engage in these conversations about use, and people not feel like they're going to have consequences around their housing or something else related to talking about use. So we've got to be at that point where we can just be open and comfortable talking about it without it being punitive. And then having, that negotiation and being able to have that discussion about, I'm not looking to tell you what you should do, but, how do I help you decrease this risk, or connect, make those connections, or maybe they're making that connection. I think I could lose my job if, okay, well, what can we do to decrease that piece? Again, the focus is on reducing harm. It's not necessarily changing or stopping a behavior. And we've talked about it can be any type of behavior. And really focusing on, again, I mentioned stages of change earlier. And at the same time, we're not condoning or condemning behavior, right? So we're neutral in that respect. And that allows us to really engage and connect with the person. Next slide. So this should have a header, and I don't know why it doesn't, but it should be kind of what harm reduction is not. It's not a means. You can go back, Matt, if you're able to go back to that other one, but it's not a means of, not a means of enabling individuals It's not anything goes, right? So it's still, you know, folks are held accountable for their behaviors and the risky activity that they're involved in. You know, it's not, we shouldn't be thinking of it as service providers as, oh, I'll do some of this harm reduction and that'll be how I get somebody into traditional substance use services, or how we'll convince them to go into, you know, treatment, those sorts of things. Now, a person may decide that is indeed what could be helpful to them, but it's not that quote hook as it says here. We're not being passive. This is in no way passive. As I mentioned, we're really engaged with someone. We're not ignoring or turning our head to the use and crossing our fingers. We're really engaged in being honest and forthright about use and
Okay, Leah, you're back, but you're muted. I can jump in if needed.
okay,
There you go.
you can hear me? Good?
Yes.
Oh, for goodness sakes. All right. Internet's getting tired on Fridays, I guess. All right. So I think we've covered a lot of these, but making sure that, you know, we're focusing on building trust, helping to keep people engaged. You know, and I think it's really key that we think about the impact of inequalities and injustices and how that greater impacts the population and the individuals that we're working with, from the standpoint of poverty and racism and classism, and that individuals that we're serving in supportive housing are most represented in these categories, and certainly overrepresented in these categories. And often people of color especially are further impacted in experiencing injustices in our legal systems and in our other systems, and inability to access those systems or have access. So when we think about harm reduction and how key that can be in, you know, helping people avoid, and again, I say avoid further connections or interactions with some of these systems, or better access to these systems. You know, it's also at the same time not saying that we're protecting people from consequences, but again, really recognizing that complexity and ultimately reducing those challenges of stigma and what it means to be someone who is labeled with these multiple labels that we give folks. And stigma makes it much harder for people, ironically enough, to reduce use or to practice harm reduction or decrease risky behaviors. A lot of these things, while it seems counterintuitive, stigma actually makes these things much worse and much more difficult to move forward in. So we as service providers need to recognize that and look at the role we play in perpetuating stigma or eliminating it. So just to show that there's certainly some research out there that supports harm reduction, this meta-analysis showed the following outcomes. So that reduction in substance use, also reduction in depression and anxiety, and those improved relationships, work stability, self-esteem. So there's tons out there that really does support this work, and especially around sterile needles. So we didn't even go there really, but huge successes there. And lastly, and this starts to get into the weeds more of harm reduction. So, but I do want to just point out that we really have to understand a person's life goals and what is that plan, and helping that person have this plan. And if we don't know the answers to these questions, we're going to have a hard time then helping a person, from a harm reduction standpoint. What are their goals around youth, right? I always say that there's something good about people using or that risky behavior that they're engaging in, right? So, addiction, I know is more than a pleasure or a benefit, but there's still a benefit, right? So we understand that with the person. But also we want to understand what harms have they experienced while they're using, or because of their use or their behavior, their risk-taking activity. What have they already done to try to avoid it? And then, really thinking about from that standpoint, when we know the answers to that, being able to help them create a plan. But that we do not kick people out of housing or services because of their use of substances. We're working with them to address those behaviors and reduce the harm. So that use is not a reason for someone to be exited from housing.
Good, thanks, Leah. So we're going to transition from there into an overview of eviction prevention, and really want to think about this from the model that we just talked about of harm reduction, right? We're trying to help individuals reduce harmful behaviors, and we want to also make sure that we are not the ones that are causing harm. And so we know, and I think we have continued to learn more and more as we've seen eviction spikes and a lot of just discussion and research on eviction rates, especially here in the pandemic. I think there's just this growing acceptance that eviction really is a harmful and violent act and can affect people for such long term, right? So we know we are taking individuals who have that history of housing instability, who have that history of trauma. We are housing them. The last thing we want to do is result in an eviction and put them right back to where they were. So we want to talk a little bit about this idea of eviction prevention and to set the stage, really kind of thinking about eviction from the perspective of a tenant, a landlord, and a provider, and showing that really it's not a good solution for anyone, right? So a tenant, I think this is relatively self-evident, right? But why is an eviction a terrible thing for a tenant? Really, it's a loss of power and control. We have someone who we've been trying to get back to having that kind of control and autonomy and independence in their life of having housing. So an eviction really puts that power dynamic back into the owner agent, into the courts who is evicting a low-income, vulnerable resident. We know that this greatly impacts future housing opportunities. So when I spoke a few minutes ago, I talked about the importance of in supportive housing, not screening out based on previous evictions and whatever landlord history may look like, whether it exists or not. But the sad truth is we know, and several of you have put comments in the chat about how hard when you're working with a client to go and find private housing for them to move into. There's a lot of kind of the buzz has kind of become talking about eviction as the quote scarlet E, right? It stays with you for your life. You have that eviction and now you go try to move in somewhere else, and a traditional market rate or affordable housing developer is running that background check on you and sees you were evicted, and in many cases you'll be screened out. So it continues to cycle that instance of homelessness and inability to maintain housing. And then of course, just thinking through the kind of the mental health and trauma side of this, especially when we're dealing with individuals who already probably have backgrounds related to mental illness and trauma. As we think about what this does to identity, pride, self-esteem. We've now rebuilt connections to support, connection to community that someone probably had lost during their tenure of homelessness, and we're taking those things away from them again. So homelessness, putting someone back into homelessness through eviction is certainly not a result we want from this program. From the landlord side, it's not good for an owner or management agent either. Evictions are expensive. Legal and court fees will be incurred. There's going to also be a loss of money from the rent from the vacancy. Now, in supportive housing, sure, you're going to go to coordinated entry and get the next referral, but it's going to take a little bit of time to find that person, to income qualify them. So you're going to have a unit that's unoccupied for some amount of time. You may never get some of the back pay and arrears from the household you evicted because they just don't have those resources. So you've lost money through the fees as well as now from the vacancy. And when you turn that unit over, you're going to have to pay probably for some cleaning, possible damage costs, et cetera, to get the unit ready again to re-rent. So again, you can just see it's terrible for the tenant, it's costly for you. So no one really benefits from the eviction, right? And then for our providers who are dealing with eviction, especially when they're dealing with clients who have gone through multiple evictions or continue to struggle to find housing, it just takes time that our providers could be using on really providing services and other case management, and instead spinning their wheels on housing location relocation. How do I help this person now with an eviction on their record find new housing? And this can certainly contribute to burnout for our providers who just begin to feel hopeless on how are we making an impact, right? So when we put this all together, the eviction is not truly beneficial for anyone. So how do we work to prevent it, right? So we really kind of think about this being a little bit cyclical, right? When we get our tenants moved in, we want to connect them with voluntary services. Yes, those services are going to be focused on their individual plans on harm reduction, but we want to also just make sure we're providing a variety of skill building that will help tenants maintain their housing. So we want to think from day one when we move someone in, let's bring that eviction prevention mentality of what services do we need to bring to this individual to keep them housing stable and to prevent a future eviction. When we get to the point that a tenant is engaging in some behavior that may be resulting into a possible eviction or that would result in an eviction in traditional housing, that's when we want to intervene. And going back to Leah's slides earlier, of course, we expect the supportive service team, case management is going to have a strong role in this, but ideally, this is certainly a collaboration with property management as well, right? So what are these interventions we can do? How can we connect with stronger services? How can we help the tenant to understand the nexus between their behaviors and the eviction and understand how to course correct, and then ultimately, to figure out what those solutions might be. So, one thing we really want to reiterate, and I think Leah did a nice job of kind of talking about this through services and harm reduction, but to bring the point home, the reason for the eviction is never going to be we're evicting you because you have a mental illness. We're evicting you because you are using substances, right? The reason for the eviction or potential eviction, we always want to point it back to the specific lease violation, right? Because that is a specific behavior we can point to in a lease and we can create a plan around to say, all right, it's not truly the drinking that is going to cause your eviction. It is the fact that when you are drinking, you're getting extremely noisy and you're disturbing your neighbors or you're breaking things or whatever, right? So we need to focus on the actual lease violation and behavior, not necessarily the root cause in this case. We still want to deal with causes and root issues as we're providing services, but in this eviction prevention mentality, we need to focus on what is the specific thing possibly leading to an eviction, and let's focus on addressing that issue. So as we say that, eviction prevention is closely tied to the lease, right? And eviction needs to be related to something that is a violation of the lease. So as service providers and case managers, we want to make sure that our tenants understand the rights and responsibilities of their lease, and that we're developing good leases at our properties that clearly state those expectations so that everyone can understand them. Now, when we get to the point of thinking about how do we create for our project an eviction prevention plan, and you would really, if you're operating supportive housing, there may be two levels of eviction prevention plans. You are going to have a property-wide eviction prevention plan that says, as an organization, as a team between property management and service providers, how are we working together to try and prevent evictions? Or sometimes we say use eviction only as a last resort, right? Then you may also then end up having an individualized eviction prevention plan, or what we may call a housing retention plan, to say, all right, Leah, you've had multiple strikes. If this was traditional housing, we would move forward with an eviction, but we now need to come up with an individualized plan to work with you to figure out how we're going to avoid this eviction, right? So this slide is really thinking more about that project-wide, organizational-wide. How do you put together a plan on what you will do to try to prevent evictions, right? So we've talked about this idea of motivational interviewing, finding out what is driving a tenant's behavior. Are there ways that we can help them reach those outcomes in a way that reduces harm? In this case, the harm being the potential eviction that's coming. Again, once we see the signs that this tenant is heading towards a potential eviction, we want to intervene. We want to get more aggressive with offering services, being very assertive in trying to engage with that tenant to keep them housed and get them connected to additional services. So consistency, follow-up. Leah used that magic term earlier. In supportive housing as a tenant, it's optional for me to accept tenant services. It's never optional for the service team to provide services. So this is where we would expect the service team to really ramp up when they see a potential eviction on the horizon, consistently follow up. Let's get services. Let's figure this out. Let's keep you stably housed. And then, finally, the last thing I want to share here is we do know sometimes, unfortunately, that a termination will need to happen. And usually in supportive housing, this would be if the tenant is becoming a true threat to other residents, to the property, violence, etc. The other thing we want to think about is even if we reach a point where we have decided that it's just not going to work for this tenant, we have implemented our broad eviction prevention plan, we've tried assertive services, we've tried an individualized plan for this individual, and we're not able to keep them housed. There are still ways to do that isn't as destructive as an eviction, right? So could we come to a mutual agreement to terminate without the actual court record of the eviction? Is their lease almost up? Could we just write it out and at least renewal time do a non-renewal instead of an eviction, right? So part of it is thinking about in those, we hope, very limited situations where you do have to end someone's tenancy in supportive housing. Are there ways to do it outside of the mechanism of an eviction, which again is going to incur those costs for everyone, is going to stay on this person's record and really hurt their ability to get housing in the future? So how might we implement kind of that harm reduction approach of maybe we need to part ways, but let's do it in a way that causes the least amount of harm to you as well as to us. So we could do a lot more. We have some great materials on our website. When we send the slides out to everyone, we'll also include IHCDA's website has a whole eviction prevention and low barrier screening webpage. We have some training materials, some one-pagers on what is eviction prevention. We have a template eviction prevention plan that you could take and fill in and kind of use to create an eviction prevention plan for your property. So we'll include those resources as supplements and would be happy to have one-on-one discussions with organizations as you think about how to use eviction only as a last resort. And we would encourage that, not only in supportive housing, but also in affordable housing. We want to reduce instances of evictions broadly across our portfolio. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of material, housing first, supportive housing principles, supportive services and harm reduction, tenant selection, eviction prevention. So let's put that all together. Let's say that question on slide 1, is supportive housing right for your organization? Those of you who have stayed with us for over 2 hours, we're hoping you're either saying yes or maybe so, right? So the question then becomes, well, what would I do next? If I do want to do this work, if I believe in this mission, if these are the clients that I want to serve, what would we do to become engaged with IHCDA and CSH in supportive housing work? And the big answer here is what we call the Indiana Supportive Housing Institute. The Institute was launched back in 2008, originally as a 6-year pilot, but we have continued it because we believe in this model so strongly. This is such a key piece of IHCDA's work and CSH's work as well. And in 2022, we completed the 14th annual Supportive Housing Institute. So number 15 will be coming up next year. Over time, the purpose of the Institute has somewhat evolved. Originally, it was about system change. In 2008, supportive housing was very new in the state of Indiana. So we were trying to change the system, really get our partners on board and get buy-in to supportive housing. While there's still some of that work to be done, now really we view the Institute as more of a capacity building and pipeline management. And what I mean by pipeline management is saying we want to take these projects that are doing this mission critical work and connect them with less competitive resources, either specially reserved or non-competitive capital funds, rental assistance funds. So we use the mechanism of the Indiana Supportive Housing Institute each year to build that pipeline of teams that then have access to special IHCDA funding to get this work done. Over the last 14 years of the Institute, we have over 50 operational projects that we have funded and built through this initiative with almost 1,300 units of supportive housing. Some of those also have other affordable housing or market rate units. So the projects contain more, but those are the units that are specifically supportive housing. We have another 10 funded developments right now that we've provided funding to that are under construction that will be bringing another 266 units online. And we're working with another 9 teams who are in progress of getting their funds. We have never not funded a team that continued to work. You may not get your funding right away on your first try, but teams that have continued to move their project concept forward post-institute have always eventually been funded. And for tenants, we have over a 90% housing stability rate of either that tenants are still there or they have positive exits to other housing outcomes rather than exiting back into homelessness. And each year we're able to get about another 250 people out of literal homelessness and into these units. So we certainly need to continue scaling up. There's certainly a demand for more supportive housing units throughout the state. And we hope some of you will be interested in being part of this model. If you think about applying for the Institute, we always say funding is important, but it's not just about funding. If you are going through the Institute, which is a 11-day over 4-month intensive training, take this and crank it up to 1,000, right? The Institute's not for you if you're just going to sit there and say, I really just want to get that check at the end. Rather, the Institute is about thoughtful design and planning. So what happens during the Institute is teams, which consist of a developer, a management company, and a service provider. Yes, there's lecture, there's presentations, but a lot of the Institute is teamwork time where you work as a table as that collaborative team and you develop an individual plan for your project, a site selection plan, a community support plan, a service plan, budgets, an eviction prevention plan, a tenant selection plan, et cetera. And the goal is at the end of the Institute, you have this packet of materials, you've put the thoughtful planning in, and you should be pretty close to ready to go out and apply for funding. So I mentioned really the key roles here. We would say that each team needs to at least have a property management company, a lead supportive service provider, which is often, but not always, a community mental health center. As Leah said, we've seen federally qualified health centers and other groups stepping into that role as well more recently. We have the developer who's going to get the funds and get the building built. And then you may have a separate entity that's going to be the owner and sponsor of the project. Often, one of those other roles, the developer or the service provider, will long-term own the building, but sometimes there's another entity that will fill that role as well. So the goal of the Institute really is to dive way deeper into what we went in today. So teams that exit the Institute should have a very strong understanding of housing first and supportive housing principles. You'll leave with a strong understanding of who on your team has what expertise and who's going to play what role, both in building the project and in operating it. As I mentioned, there's a variety of plans and budgets that you will create throughout the process and have with you that's individual to your specific project. And you will also leave with kind of a common understanding of set standards that you have created with your cohort of other Institute teams, as well as with your individual team, to say, what do we define as quality housing? What are the design and site selection criteria we're going to use to ensure this is the highest quality housing? So why would you want to go through an Institute? Well, we believe that there's a lot of good benefits here. As I mentioned, you do get access to either non-competitive or specially reserved, less competitive capital funds from IHCDA to build the project. You would also potentially get access to IHCDA project-based rental assistance. Depending on where your project is located, you may instead access local rental assistance. We would work with you to make that decision. Institute teams also gain access to a $50,000 0% interest project initiation loan. This is a pre-development loan to help you post-institute do the things you need to do to continue getting your project ready for funding. If for some reason the project didn't move forward, that loan could be forgiven. But if your project gets funded, the $50,000 would be repaid back at the time you closed on your financing and started construction. Of course, the training and education and the peer networking is a huge component. 11 days of working with IHCDA staff, CSH staff, as well as that cohort of other teams. There's a lot of peer sharing and best practice. And again, you'll leave with knowledge, a funding plan, and the ability to move forward and do what you need to do in your community. So the Institute is usually held each year in Bloomington, Indiana. As I mentioned, it's 11 days across 4 months, and it usually runs roughly February through June or so. We release an annual request for proposals. We'll be releasing that, should be either late September or early October, for teams who want to participate in the 2023 Institute. So you would be able to apply and tell us about I'm seeing Troy's going to apply. I look forward to getting that application. So you would need to put together a team, your developer, your property management company, your service provider. You would tell us kind of who you are, what experience you have, how you're going to work together. It's really narrative based. And then you'd also give us kind of a high level understanding of what your proposed concept is. And then if you were selected, you would get to go through the 4 months of training and ultimately apply for funds. So that RFP will go out in, like I said, it should be probably late September. When it goes out, we will host another webinar specific to the RFP requirements and allow Q&A to ask questions, and you'll have ample time to respond to that RFP. This is just a list. I'm not going to go through this. We've talked about it a bit already, and you will receive these slides. This is just a list of kind of all those things you'll get to develop in the Institute. Again, MOUs between your project partners, your support plans, your budgets, your tenant protection plans, tenant selection plans, tenant engagement plans. Again, you're going to walk out of the Institute really with a plan to say, we can build this, we can operate it, we understand how to do this work. But it won't end there. You would still continue to receive ongoing technical assistance from IHCDA and CSH Post-Institute. All of our projects in our portfolio, we do regular site visits with, and you would have continuous access to our resources as you learn, and we would continue to provide plenty of training. So again, just kind of a little bit of a timeline. Expect mid to late September to see the RFP. Probably around late November, then they would be due. We'll let you know who's selected. Usually it's the first week of January, and then the process would start in February. So with that, here's my contact information and Leah's contact information. Feel free to reach out at any time. We can also connect you to our fellow coworkers at IHCDA and CSH. And with that, our main goal is we hope you walk away today saying, I have a better understanding of supportive housing and housing first. And ideally that you're saying, and I think I can do it. I think it's a mission fit for me. And we hope to see many of you responding to the RFP this fall. So with that, we do have about 10 minutes available for question and answers. There were 2 things I wanted to address that I had punted in the chat and hadn't addressed yet. And the first is we were getting a lot of questions about this concept of it's very hard to serve clients who have are justice involved, who have criminal records. And even if you were to go through the Institute and build supportive housing, we know those units aren't going to come online for a few years, right? Because you have to go through the whole process. You've got to build. So it'd be a couple of years before those units came online. So what do you do in the interim to serve those clients? I want to put a plug quickly for another program that IHCDA administers called Home Tenant-Based Rental Assistance. This is a statewide program that provides grants to nonprofit organizations to provide tenant-based rental assistance to individuals who are either imminently exiting a correctional facility and are at risk of becoming homeless, or those who have already exited and are housing unstable. So this is an annual RFP we put out. You would receive funds for tenant-based rental assistance. You would then work with those individuals and get them, you wouldn't build housing. This would be, you'd be working with them to find landlords in the community. Victoria manages that program. She has put the website in there that provides information on that program. Again, it's entirely for formerly incarcerated individuals who are either exiting or have already exited. That RFP should also be going out here late August, early September, and there'll be a webinar about that information. So if you're serving that justice involved population, we would strongly encourage you. We would love to see some new grantees this year under that program. The second thing I hadn't addressed yet, and my answer is not going to be very satisfactory, especially because you've waited about an hour and a half, but we did have a question in the chat that was about in supportive housing and or affordable housing, what can I do to curb gun violence? And am I able to, prohibit guns on my property? This is a question we at IHCDA and CSH have been starting to receive more. Actually, we've had that question a couple times from other partners this week. And I think it's a combination of, seeing mass shootings in the news, as well as, changes in state law about carrying laws. The answer is we don't have a solid answer for you at this time. And while IHCDA and CSH are both well positioned to provide connections to housing resources, to provide technical assistance, one thing we are both prohibited from doing is providing legal advice, even though we have legal staff on our teams. This really does veer into that legal side. If you're trying to say we want to prohibit or limit firearms at our properties, I'm absolutely not saying you should or shouldn't do it. It's a great discussion to have, whether you're talking about affordable housing, market rate housing, supportive housing, et cetera. We would strongly encourage you to reach out to your legal counsel and figure out how to address that. And if you are going to take steps to limit or prohibit, to figure out how to legally do that with your lease and other documents. So it's an item we know is on people's mind. There's no program regulations about it, so it's outside of our wheelhouse a bit. It really comes down to kind of federal, state, and local law. So we would encourage you to talk to your legal counsel. All right, we've answered all the questions from the chat. Again, you will in the next couple of days receive a copy of the slides. We'll get this recording posted as well on the CSH website, I believe, Leah. We'll also send you contact information and these links to the supportive housing map, the TBRA program, et cetera. Any additional questions here in the last 5 minutes, feel free to either unmute or put it in the chat. And Leah, I'll also ask if you had anything else you wanted to add. I shouldn't close without giving you that opportunity.
No, perfect. You covered those other questions, and that's what I had in mind. So perfect.
Okay. Okay, going once, going twice. All right, it is Friday afternoon. You hung with us for 2.5 hours. We know this was a ton of content. The questions were excellent. The engagement was excellent. We'd love to continue the engagement. So if this is of interest to you and you want more information, reach out. We're happy to do one-on-one discussions. We hope to get to know many of you better. Thank you very much for your interest in this, for doing the work you do to serve vulnerable populations. We're here to support you in that mission, and I hope you all have a great weekend.
I have one weird addition.
Oh, sure.
We absolutely welcome your questions and input. We want to work with you. Once the RFP comes out, that the ability for us to then provide that input for that period, we're not able to do so. So just wanted to say that we encourage you over the next 6 weeks or so, if you have thoughts and questions, and get to us now before the RFP comes out. Just so, and thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, everyone. I thought that went well. Good. Oh, yeah. I think it's recording now.